The difference between having a job and having a vocation is that a job is some unpleasant work you do in order to make money, with the sole purpose of making money. And there are plenty of jobs because there is still a certain amount of dirty work that nobody wants to do, and that therefore they will pay someone to do it. There is essentially less and less of that kind of work because of mechanization. But if you do a job with the sole purpose of making money, you are absurd. Because if money becomes the goal, and it does when you work that way, you begin increasingly to confuse it with happiness or with pleasure. Yes, one can take a whole handful of crisp dollar bills and practically water your mouth over them. But this is as kind of a person who is confused, like a Pavlov dog who salivates on the wrong bell. It goes back, you see, to the ancient guilt that if you don't work, you have no right to eat. That if there are others in the world who don't have enough to eat, you shouldn't enjoy your dinner, even though you have no possible means of conveying the food to them. And while it is true that we are all one human family, and that every individual involves every other individual, while it is true, therefore, we should do something about changing the situation, the one way of not doing anything about a situation is feeling guilty about it. Because when people feel guilty about a situation, you most usually, instead of doing something practical to change it, they resort to all sorts of symbolic methods of expiation. They go to confession. They see an analyst. They do all kinds of things which will be ways of actually not doing anything about the problem, but feeling all right about it instead. And guilt invariably produces that sort of reaction. It is a destructive emotion. And instead, we need to have a different attitude to our mistakes and to our misdeeds. Walt Whitman always admired animals because they do not lie awake at night and weep for their sins. Animals are practical in the real sense, as are children who haven't been taught this extraordinary hang-up of guilt. Because if you have done something wrong, or you have made a mistake, and somebody makes you ashamed of it, you run around licking the sores of your wounded ego because you feel your pride has been hurt. The first thing to understand is that it is not a serious failing in a human being to make mistakes. Everybody has to make mistakes. There is no way out of it. You can't learn anything unless you make mistakes.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, listeners. Ben McLeish of the Zeitgeist Movement UK, wishing you, I suppose, if, as Peter said last year, we bracket out our lives this way, a Happy New Year. I'm here today just briefly to speak about some news and events that are coming up in movement land, the kind of stuff we've been getting up to, the public speaking, the various releases of media and whatever, and upcoming events of any kind that should be of interest to the membership. First off, I'll run into a couple of bits of news. Obviously now we're, January the 8th, 2014. The Zeitgeist Movement every year does an event called Zeitgeist Day, or Z-Day, once a year, usually in March, so that's upcoming. Many different cities tend to focus around the second weekend in March. It does vary every now and again, though. This year, the movement's main focus, I would say, or what we've somehow come to call the main event, will be in Toronto, in Canada. Details for that will be up in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out over the next general quarter of a year for the upcoming details on that. Those will most likely be posted on zdayglobal.org, which attempts to aggregate the various events around the world that form a sort of TED-style experience of more intellectual speeches and lectures, essentially broadly to the movement, but certainly by the movement, or at least collated by the movement. In previous years, we have had events which have essentially acted as a meeting point and a gathering point for similarly minded organizations, and in order to foster some kind of worldview out of whatever each of them had to say. So it very much varies depending on where you are, but that's roughly what we see. And then a little bit of news that's coming up as well. Other than that, recently we've had a decent amount of media attention. Harold Channer, who is a very well-known interviewer on in the media, has actually interviewed in 1 week, in fact, in 3 days in a row, Peter Joseph, Federico Pistono, and Bakari Pace. I believe Bakari's, in fact, went out yesterday. That would have been the 7th of January, 2014. Peter's, as far as I know, has gone out today, or will go out today. And then Federico is tomorrow on the 9th of January. So the listings are up on channer.tv. It's CHANNER.tv. And they will be listed there for a while. So that's in the schedule. They basically take up most of that website at the moment because they're very prominent photos that Harold uses to describe his subjects. So that's coming up there. That's been a very interesting one. The Peter's one has been out for a while. Bakari's one is actually, I think, been out for a while as well, at least if these are the same ones. If not, they're being re-interviewed. So that should be very interesting. And we have another, actually, for those of you in the UK specifically, I suppose, really in London, and interested in the technological singularity side of some of the readings and writings that accompany a sort of a worldview that deals with technology in this way. If any of you find that kind of thing interesting, I'm going to be speaking at Anticipating 2025 on the 23rd of March. That, for the UK bunch, for the London chapter at least, is the week after Zeitgeist Day. But it'll be the same speech, though, that I'm doing in both. I don't quite have the mental strength to do two a week apart, but I'm sure I'll riff on them in some way, not to make it complete parroting. But yep, that's coming up as well. There's a couple of very interesting people there. I mean, I would really probably go. I would have gone to the event anyway, I think, because there are many, many people listed on the site. Some of the very big names in the sort of technological singularity arena, people like Natasha Vita-Moore, the sort of body modification side of things, and quite a few. Aubrey de Grey is speaking there as well, although admittedly on a different day to me, which is good. I feel quite good about that, that I don't have to be horrendously upstaged. So that's going to happen as well. And I have also had a couple of conversations recently with movement members who have asked what some of the basic books would be to get into. These are sort of new arrivals who have maybe joined in the last 6 months, something like that. And that got me to thinking about that, because we haven't, for a while, I suppose, talked about some of the decent sources that can get people started on this stuff. Although, I must admit, I find that most people have read quite adequately by the time they come across this. I think it's in the process of research quite often that this comes up, that our media comes up. But I thought I'd mention some very, very briefly. The cornerstone and the book whose second edition is, I would say, largely down to the movement's work and promotion and reading and sort of engagement with, is McMurtry's Cancer Stage of Capitalism. It's now in its second edition. You can get it as a hardback. The good thing is you can get it as an ebook, which actually is quite useful. I think I've said that on the show before. I find that with the writing being the way it is, which is fairly dense and fairly academic, but very, very able indeed, and quite enjoyable after a while once you tune into it. It's quite fun to sort of hear the register that Professor McMurtry can adopt. In this book and in its previous first edition, which is different enough to actually warrant a second copy of. I did have both for a while until I gave one away. Those are what we use to describe something that in the movement we've tried to enunciate and articulate with everything really that we talk about, and that is that there is a fundamental systems issue with the modern day. And I'm going to be banging on about that in a minute in one particular angle. But this book helps with part of that. It does explain in a very academic but very detailed way the way that a system can register to itself and its population, usually, healthy signs, things like the stock market, abstracted numbers that don't relate to real life and the actual environment, and advertise itself as successful and reinforcing and useful and clean and blameless, and yet, of course, be operating a different way. Not just through laziness, but through a systemic market pressure of cost and profit above everything. This book will help you with all of that. So if you're new, I would recommend it. I must admit, it is extremely expensive, at least I've found. But I think there are gradually second-hand copies coming around because it's been out for a while. I would give that caveat, I suppose, but it's I certainly got it because I enjoyed it. The other one that I usually recommend, purely because it's in the kind of terms that we can pick up if we may be new to this stuff, but still want to know a decent amount and want a big worldview and want a sort of this global view that we talk about, because that's quite a hard thing. You can't communicate a worldview on a global scale. You have to get people to seek it out for themselves, otherwise it's not a worldview at all, I suppose. But this book does that, and it does it in plain English, although in colourful English, and that's Critical Path by R. Buckminster Fuller, which attempts to describe a global attitude that includes things like universal resource management and a heavy emphasis on something called ephemeralization, which is the practice of doing more with less. By definition, being more efficient, less input, more output, greater buildings and stronger buildings and less materials in terms of, he even does it in cubic feet as far as I know, in terms of materials. And it sort of spirals out from there, beginning actually with a speculative history of the human race, which is fascinating. Talks about how primal peoples or very early shipbuilding folk, essentially when they learned to go against the tide and not just go to the east, if you like, on the globe, but also to be able to traverse the west in oncoming wind, allowed for a value shift in regards to the environment, in regards to things like fatalism as well. The fact that you can defy the odds, you can defy a natural order, or at least overcome certain issues with technology. Very interesting book. It'll leave you thinking for a while. A lot of it was new to me. Its claims about human origins was fairly new to me, so I had to double check all that stuff. But you do, and it leads you onto some fascinating material. So in that sense, it's a decent repository of all the stuff that it cites as well, because it really gets you to look it up and find out more about it. He's a very compelling writer. Fuller was, of course, on the doorstep of death. Essentially, I mean, he was going to be committing suicide. He got to the very limits of his life. I think after the death of one of his children, and some very, very difficult, I think bankruptcy was part of it too. And he decided in a snap decision that he had to save himself. And the only way to doing that would be to save the entire planet's human population, every single person, make it measurably better for absolutely everybody. Only in that way was he totally safe. Only in that way would he have a future that was worth considering. And that itself gets you thinking. Just the introduction to this book will get you thinking about what kind of person this was and what kind of worldview that is and how it affects how you behave in the world. It's fascinating. It can be a tad expensive as well, unfortunately, but actually I've found now that places like Amazon do have it for a couple of pounds, couple of dollars, whatever your denomination is, and it's not too impossible. The last book is actually that I'll talk about now anyway, because there are, in fact, as I should point out, quite a lot of reading lists online. There is one on the main website. There's one on the UK website, the Zeitgeist Movement UK.com. And there's a reading list on there as well. Hasn't been updated in a while, but there's a decent amount there, and does include a lot of Fuller's other stuff as well, of course, along with Jacques Fresco. And when it comes to things like violence and crime and social status, we have quite a few works from James Gilligan up there as well, which are very worth checking out. But this last book hasn't gone up there yet, and it's only because it doesn't quite suit a theme. But it is a useful repository, whilst not quite being the solution that we talk about. But it is actually quite a positive thing. Gets you thinking in a more connected way, at least. And it's called World Changing. These gentlemen have existed since 2006. They have, I think, just released a newer version of this as well. And it's essentially a sort of an encyclopedic guide into all the different parts of our life, from stuff all the way through to fashion, all the way through to environmental practices, energy, and everything. And it makes a couple of, bullet points. It has some interesting images of what's going on around the world in terms of disasters, as well as also of good efforts to try and combat the environmental effects that are happening. But I'll give you an idea of what it's like, actually. The first page, you'll see the register of what it's talking about. It begins with sort of sustainable practices, and it just says, the chapter is entitled Stuff. Our things define us. What we buy, what we use, what we keep and what we throw away, what we waste and what we save. The stuff that surrounds us and flows through our lives is a key indicator of the kinds of lives we're living. To be an affluent 21st century person is to float on a sea of material objects, each with its own history and future. They may be hidden from our eyes, but in practical global terms, those histories and futures tend to be the most important aspects of the stuff that we own. The moment we tear the wrapper on from a new toy, that toy is already at the end of a sweeping story involving the mining of metals, the pumping of oil, the operation of huge factories, the shipping of cargo containers, the printing of packaging materials, the purchase of advertising, the careful arranging of store shelves, and the final drive home. Simply buying, say, a new laptop connects us with a web of activity that spans the planet. You see the view of it. That's the end of the reading. But you see the kind of level they're going for. It's quite interesting. They do bit by bit, and they have various solutions. Of course, they tend to be, as they must be, to do with changing your buying habits, which is a part of the equation. But of course, anybody listening to this who's followed our tenets for probably 25 minutes or more will understand that one of our talking points is, of course, that ultimately we can't completely solve everything with the market. It has to be outgrown, evolved from, just like we don't really have an appendix anymore. It doesn't really do much if we take it out. That's a strange thing to say, but I will. So it's an interesting one. I would suggest that's more probably of a library job, to be honest with you, and given that what we advocate is to do with shared resources, it would sort of be ironic, I suppose, to buy the book outright when it does exist at the library, or at least you can demand it at the library. That's always a nice little campaign to do, actually. I think I might do that with Leeds Library. They don't have Jacques Fresco's book yet, or maybe some stuff by Fuller, so I don't have to buy so much. So those are quite good. There are a couple of others. Like I say, check out the website, because I don't want to bash on too much about all of them. Let's see if I haven't gone off tangent too much. No, that's right. There is one other book, maybe, that I would suggest only by way of introduction to what I wanted to briefly talk about, that it's been bothering my mind over Christmas. I wanted to talk for a section about PR and about propaganda and how those two relate and what that is. This is a topic that we've trodden a couple of times, and it's known tolerably well these days because of a couple of bits of media that have addressed this quite well. But I will kick off this particular section by asking whoever's listening, I invite you to identify the writer of the following paragraph. Quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." Now, if you were to guess who that is, the people who know would know, I suppose, straight away. But, I mean, when I first read that, I thought, well, no doubt that's some fascist dictator's diary. I don't know, perhaps the old A.H. himself, Adolf Hitler, or, whose Mein Kampf seems to be climbing the ranks of the Kindle bestseller list for some reason. I don't know why that is. I saw an article today. It was occupying 2 positions. Well, if it's not him, it's some government lobbyist, perhaps a monarch of some kind, seeking to undermine or overthrow the rational decision-making efforts of his or her subjects. Something like that. Or some madman, I don't know. Ted Kaczynski, could it be? I don't know. Well, in fact, the quotation from the opening actually forms the opening barrage of a book by the man who essentially pioneered the public relations industry, Edward Bernays. His name is better known these days thanks to, you've already probably thought about it if you did recognize that name, the incredible documentary by Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self, which I think is 3 or 4 parts, delves into the modern moulding of desires and wants and the general consumption behavior by Bernays, who was a nephew of Freud. In fact, when you read back across that quotation, you read the section essentially that says that this must happen. It's a necessary design, that societies are brainwashed by a few men because they have to live together. Actually does betray Sigmund Freud's ideas that the human being was essentially just almost akin to a beast that needed control, that had innate desires that were destructive and dangerous and antisocial and must be controlled, can't just naturally exist. Something that I'm not sure I agree with. I don't think well, I certainly don't agree with it. Human beings who are treated well and who have what they need, they tend to be all right. You know, it's fairly obvious. You treat a person poorly, and that treating can be environmental, it can be indirect. In fact, it mostly is indirect. It is mostly the system that weighs down in various different forms. It can be a large bill. It's a systemic obstruction to your welfare. It can be intolerably high rents. This happens all the time. There was rent control in the US precisely because people will jack the price up to as much as they can. All these things do impact the psychological welfare of people, yet they're only seen as economic things. Oh, it's just rent is a lot. But think about all the different things. Kids get deprived from different kinds of schools. That, you know, raises or lowers an educational level on a rough scale as well, if you compare it for everybody. And of course, it delineates certain neighborhoods or even just certain households into certain classes. Fascinating. You can't argue, I suppose, that this is at all geared towards complete unity of the human frame. So when Bernays says that kind of thing, he's sort of right, but he's right about the way that this system behaves. It is utterly expected to find manipulation and difficulty and poverty and ignorance and the slow cultural lag that we experience. The reason we experience cultural lag is precisely because our present society is suboptimal and is making us its suboptimal subjects almost in a way. But this is sort of interesting because, I mean, what is public relations? Public relations itself, as a phrase, is in fact quite an Orwellian phrase because it sounds quite nice. Relations is, of course, lovely. We think of relationship. We think of family relations. And public, oh, well, that's lots of people. But we're talking about propaganda. And that, indeed, is the name of the book by Bernays. He did call it propaganda. So I don't think I'm jumping to too many conclusions. I don't think that I'm projecting onto anything. This gentleman flat out knew and flat out said in black and white that controlling the public is desirable and doable and through any means possible. And that's exactly what we see. I mean, yes, it is itself a weasel phrase. I mean, propaganda is, I mean, it's almost built into our lives completely. And I mean, and while we may complain and bemoan the fact that Bernays facilitates the practice of, for example, as I found out, eating bacon for breakfast, which was unheard of before it was injected via advertising into the dominant culture because the pork farmers wanted to sell more, or supporting the sugar industry, as has happened in general throughout PR, even when it is there's fairly decent evidence to suggest that, you know, it's well, at the very least, something that causes extreme obesity and essentially acts as some kind of poison. Yeah, well, it's not that extreme, but extremely debilitating. Or the practice of cigarette smoking for ladies, which wasn't accepted. This is where Curtis's documentary comes in handy, because he covers these sorts of areas that he did, in which ladies set up, well, they were all inside a march of some kind, and they all lit up cigarettes at the same time and called them torches of freedom. And that's how it was branded in the papers. And that was what introduced smoking to the general public. Note that it wasn't done through billboard advertising or through audio advertising. It was done via something that imitated life, something that imitated an event. So public relations isn't just clever articles and placed advertorials. Actually, we see quite a lot of the time that they are the events themselves that become the conduit for understandings about various products that are on the market. That's the kind of thing that we see. And so it sort of sneaks its way in ways that we're not even looking for when we're even aware of it. Yes, I mean, it does actually raise a few rather important points when we consider the whole role that trying to grab your mind makes. It does sort of demonstrate that like a market of any kind, the economic systems in and of themselves don't necessarily, or as a product of their own system setup, deliver good health or well-being. It's not a given. It's a possibility, but it's not a given. Just the structure itself doesn't do it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be extreme amounts of distortion and fraud and misalignment with nature and all the rest that we see. So we just have to bear that in mind. Propaganda is also a product that can be bought and sold on the market as much as any life-serving good like food or other nutritious elements or things that are life-supportive. Instead, this is a particular type of propaganda that's being bought and sold in order to buy and sell other areas of the market. So there's all kinds of problems that we can already get there. And the other problem is that people always talk about rational self-maximization. Well, if we were so damn rational, then we wouldn't be worth so much to chase in terms of the PR industry and the marketing and the advertising. There wouldn't be this much money dedicated to studying the human brain's reaction to different colors and building in associations from very early childhood that get maintained in a sort of a systemic way in your brain. I mean, if we were so rational, that's not a very efficient way of perceiving reality. So that's something that also needs to be tempered for anybody who makes absolutes about human market activity or the market itself. It's not naturally free, and people are not naturally rational, or there really wouldn't be advertising and the kind of psychological tearing down of the consumer's mind and their buying habits and various advertising tricks and weasel words as there are, because we would be immune to so much more of it. And that's really, I suppose, what the journey for most of us here is at the Zeitgeist Movement. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I do consider my membership with interaction with the various members and the various materials you end up finding and reading and the kind of worldview we cultivate of global cooperation. We've forgotten this positive side. Recently, with so many bad stories, we've totally forgotten the wonders of everything. Scientists have recently, for example, I believe it was Daniel Nocera, who was a chemist who synthesized photosynthesis. He did artificial photosynthesis in 2013. So we're now creating energy in a sort of biological way, admittedly on a small scale. It's of course a lab experiment, but it's been done now. That wasn't done before. All the advances in solar and everything might even be trumped by some sort of biologically based synthesis of energies on Earth via sunlight. Could be. But, just that's one tiny story. We're gradually getting to the point where we could really apply this stuff in ways that make it ridiculous the way that we live now. That in the future, people will look back and go, my God, isn't it funny? Can you imagine? They used to get kicked out of their houses for not paying this thing called money. And their life needs were totally undervalued. And they're like, well, you know what? You just got to find a new place. And even if you can't find a new place, it's not our concern. We are landlords. We are not fellow human beings and all the rest of it. Much worse stuff happens, of course, as well. But do understand that this division between what public relations tells you, wonderful, nice facts about not just shiny new products, but also different news situations, the type of line and the type of talking points that channels have themselves is a direct result of the public relations industry pressures in terms of general behind-the-scenes lobbying and promotion and all the rest of it. So the very perception of events at all, doesn't matter what they really are, tend to be focused on a certain way. And you do notice this with different channels, because of course there are different entities that are trying, but a great many of the mainstream ones behave the same way, one notices. Nobody really covers Fukushima anymore, even though there are disastrous things happening there, including the sort of radioactive buildup on the west coast of the US, which has just been announced. I mean, that means that entire area is irradiated. That's quite a large story. But notice that the PR and managed news and all the rest of it tends to focus on stuff that supports the actual society itself, and that just doesn't support it. It's an externality. We don't need that. Now, that is a generalized behavior. That is what we talk about when we say the zeitgeist. That's what we generally mean. Anything else, to address anything else, is ultimately going to be pointless. One has to understand the general value set and the adaptation of the general value set back from the managed news to the actual news, to the real events, to the real discoveries that have been made and can be made on top of it. This is the kind of level we want to be operating on. And that's the great divide. on one side, we have the fictionalized version of reality, and with the real-world consequences in very negative ways. Pollution and instability and war and all the rest of it all do come from the inability to live like every other thing does on the planet, which is with the species supported and with the ecosystem supported. This is a value shift that can be achieved with technology, but with that different level, a newer level of education, one that I never received, one that wasn't built into my curriculum. I can tell you now, I learned Latin. I didn't learn systems theory. I sort of wish I had. Latin was great, all right. I wasn't very good at it. Anyway, sorry, wandering off there. But yes, there we are. So that's sort of quite important. But I mean, this thing does extend even further, further from managing companies that produce certain products, whether that be cigarettes, whether it be anything that's marginally difficult or requires some sort of sensibility to sell in a managed way. All the way through to certain companies just having their general names understood in certain ways, and then certain news stories, things like this sort of macular degeneration can be treated with this, and that company happens to own it. That happens all the time as well, of course. Planted news, which is then reported, recorded, and sold back as media coverage to promote the actual products or efforts or whatever it is. It can, of course, also be charities sometimes that use public relations. So it's not just corporate, of course. But it's a method of interaction. It's a method of changing what may be perceived to what would like to be perceived by that particular area. And that, I think, stems from, and what we claim, stems from the misalignment of our general understandings about what it means to live on a planet and the finiteness of it. There are certain sensibilities that we've inherited, like a pile of old furniture from a dead aunt, and some of it's useful, but some of it really isn't. Some of it's a terribly looking chair, and you just want to get rid of it, but you don't really know how to get rid of it. But then people tell you can't get rid of the red chair. No, sorry, you have to keep all of this. She died and left it to you. It's like that, but with a planet full of stuff, and a planet full of highways that can't be moved, and they're just all in the wrong place sometimes because we built it around a country, not around the world network. And new technologies, but no one will let you build them, like ET3's evacuated tube transport. Extremely reliable and fast trains. Guess what? Use less of the old oil and coal, which is, as Buckminster Fuller puts it as well in a different book, if anybody's interested, the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. So these are the batteries, these are the raw materials from which to fashion the infrastructure that then harvests sunlight. Because, again, as another author that we do recommend, Jeremy Rifkin, who's a sort of an economist and is, I would say, broadly on our side, or at least broadly understands the systemic nature of what the future means and what now means. What he has sort of just talked about before is photosynthesis is the basic economy of the planet. It's not money. Money is, what was it? Socrates, I believe, an artifact of law, not of nature. Sorry, I've named far too many authors in a row there. You can tell I was preparing for this show for too long. I got a bit florid with things. I'll stop that. But the very basic energy income, the thing that we are using the old reserves of in terms of oil and coal, is the sunlight, is the stuff that hits us from the sun. Without that, pretty much everything stops. We can see that that's mostly the case elsewhere. Even if there is old ice or water found on other planets, we haven't found much else yet, but you would require at least that. This has been forgotten as we've tried to outbuy our environment and replace its negative effects with yet more awful things and byproducts of unnecessary processes or outdated processes or processes that are more dangerous than useful just because they'll turn a buck, because the PR can be managed. As we buy more and more to medicate, both in a literal sense of the drugs that we end up taking because of the society's effects, or non-literally or metaphorically in terms of the new purchase of anything, indulging in what that shopping behavior is called retail therapy, right? Yes, of course. This all seems to be, should lead us to one conclusion, and that is that we have to get away from that kind of managed news. It's interesting to see which shows vanish. I have here a short segment from Lee Camp that, if I can get to work, actually outlines this better than I can.
So here now are the 5 most crucial underreported stories of 2013. It's certainly not all of them, it's just a few of them, because reporting all of them would take until 2025. The Boston bombing shocked America. 2 dipshits killed 4 people and the corporate media shat themselves and then smeared it across your TV screen. Most of what was reported that day was wrong, but who cares? It was CNN's highest ratings in years. A month later, the FBI were interrogating an unarmed acquaintance of the Boston bombers, Ibrahim Todashev, and after 4.5 hours of chatting with him, they decided to shoot him 7 times, once in the back of the head, which at the very least is poor manners for house guests. The corporate media hardly mentioned this story, and in fact, half of you watching this video right now are going, "What? When did that happen?" We're the media. We're over 60% accurate on the stories we decide to tell you about. But don't worry, America. Focus on this instead.
On December 6th, Kiss FM's Jingle Ball got a surprise visit from bad Mrs. Claus.
Just this week, it came out that Attorney General Eric Holder and the Justice Department are protecting the big banks against a criminal investigation because the big banks are really having a tough time getting ahead here in the United States. Federal bank examiners have been trying to figure out what J.P. Morgan Chase knew about Bernie Madoff and his massive Ponzi scheme, but the Justice Department won't enforce the subpoenas, because why should we know whether J.P. Morgan helped one of the biggest financial terrorists of all time? That is none of our business. And besides, J.P. Morgan Chase has affluenza. It's not their fault they don't know right from wrong. And this goes along with Eric Holder's testimony in March that big banks are too fucking big to even prosecute. He said it could hurt the nation's economy to bring a criminal charge against the largest criminals in the country. If prosecuting them from wrongdoing could hurt the nation's economy, then just imagine what telling them they're too big to prosecute could do to the nation. Good God, they would have free rein to smack the shit out of us. Oh, they do. It's like telling a serial murderer who's gripping the nation with fear that what he's doing is wrong, but you won't be prosecuting him because he's a celebrity now and it's good for news ratings. Do you think he might keep slashing people's throats? Do you think he might giggle like a schoolgirl while he's doing it? If you walked into J.P. Morgan Chase right this minute, I can guarantee you there's some giggling going on. One more note on the big banks that I'm sure you already learned because corporate media talked about it all the never. The big banks do nothing but transfer billions of dollars from taxpayers to shareholders. They are a giant money laundering scheme. Right now you're thinking, hold on, listen. Why should I pay attention to a crazy comedian with a beard like yours? All right, I've written off comedians for so much as a handlebar mustache, I'll have you know. You don't have to believe me. Believe the editors of Bloomberg.com. This is a quote directly from them. The top 5 big banks account for $64 billion of the total subsidy paid by taxpayers to the banks, an amount roughly equal to their typical annual profits. In other words, the banks would just about break even in the absence of corporate welfare. In large part, the profits that they report are essentially transfers from taxpayers to shareholders. Unquote. That's from Bloomberg, not some hippie with a hacky sack or some video gamer with a sticky sack. But who is truth to tell me what to decide? Look at this instead.
When I turned 16, I got a Prada backpack, and it had the triangle gold Prada symbol
that you would polish.
It was my favorite piece ever.
Many people know that the Keystone XL pipeline is being called the nail in the coffin for stopping climate change, and many people stepping out of their mindless consumerist mindset is bad for business. So the old fart oligarchs got together and said, okay, what do we do with the Keystone XL? Let's see. We could not build the pipeline and let the planet live. I'd sooner vote for Raul Castro for president. We could give the actual information about the pipeline to the American people and let them decide in a democratic manner. I'd sooner lick John Candy's ass, God rest his soul. Or we could change the name of the pipeline to something so boring that it makes the eyes of your average American roll so far back in their heads that they can see their own brain, which is shriveled to the size of a grape nut and is scared and shivering like a dachshund in Chicago in January without his sweater on. Something like Gulf Coast Project. Yeah, no one will give a fuck about that. It sounds like some kind of sports retreat for rich white guys in Barbados. That's right, the southern half of the Keystone XL pipeline has the new name, the Gulf Coast Pipeline Project, and it's slated to begin carrying oil in a few weeks. And here's how much you've heard about this from the corporate media. Kind of like if Lady Gaga changed her name to Carl. No one would talk about her anymore. No offense to Carl. But of course the biggest unmentionable story of 2013, the story that blew out all others in terms of just how much it did not get talked about, the story that is like a black hole, not even light escaped from it, is Beyonce. Why is no one talking about her? She deserves a little bit of press, alright? A little bit of attention. She's worked very hard. No, actually, it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the two biggest trade deals in the history of humankind, which are being pushed through Congress as we speak and are designed to give away national sovereignty to corporations. But perhaps there's a justifiable reason why the corporate media is not covering this story. Here's a side-by-side comparison. Trans-Pacific Partnership, very confusing to understand. Beyonce, very understandable. Those hips don't lie, alright? Trans-Pacific Partnership, shitty dancers. Beyonce, great dancer. Trans-Pacific Partnership does bad things like destroy what's left of our republic. Beyonce does good things like Jay-Z. Trans-Pacific Partnership, very secretive. Not even Congress is really allowed to see it. Only corporate lobbyists and the president have access. Beyonce, totally not secretive. In fact, she made a goddamn documentary about herself in case there was anyone left who didn't know something about her. Trans-Pacific Partnership, never done a single positive thing for women. Beyonce delivers a great message for young women while also kindly letting them know they should drink toxic liquid. As you can see, Beyonce, so much more fun to cover than Trans-Pacific Partnership. Shut up, facts!
Mr. Camp being Mr. Camp. Isn't it amazing when you listen back to that and you just realize, I don't know if you're like me, I missed a few of those. I didn't quite miss the name change. I missed the name change of the Keystone XL pipeline. It did remind me immediately of another story, which you can look up yourselves, actually. A former Goldman Sachs executive who changed name, now trying to ease bank regulation. There's a man who changed his name after working for Goldman Sachs, so he could essentially carry on working under that type of guise, or to shed past issues. It's kind of an interesting one, using his mother's maiden name. Just reminded me that we swap out certain types of behaviors or meanings just in terms of the words for them, for other words. It's simply, I suppose, the basic form of propaganda. I think even changing your name is a form of public relations, since your name is, of course, equated with something, or should be not acquainted with something. For example, you want to eradicate the fact that you used to work for Goldman Sachs, either for good or for bad reasons, I suppose. It's the kind of logic that actually runs through every part of our society, down to even the word profit. Profit sort of makes us think of gain, makes us think of becoming more immune to the problems of life. But of course we do understand that actually the profit turn now is simply the deconversion of life material and of the healthy environment and of our own minds, and the composting, if you like, the composting of that into just money, into just wealth as measured by dollars or created currency than by actual life serving. Now, the problem is, it gets worse than that, even that, I'm afraid, people. Propaganda actually ends up inhabiting entire mindsets and ideologies as well, and can convert entire ways of thinking into actually operating in a different way. One example I can use is the modern version of libertarianism. This is, it's the sort of the major culprit of this one for probably anything that one can name in the last 50 years. Modern libertarianism, as expressed by sort of leaders and politicians and business magnates, now we hear them all the time. Ron Paul is a libertarian. There are quite a few libertarians on the, I suppose, rough Republican side. There are totally independent libertarians, but there are voices now that are very loud. The thing is that some of them are referencing a type of libertarianism that was essentially recreated in the 50s. It has nothing to do with, I don't know, William Godwin and John Locke's sort of works on the subject during the sort of the early days of talking about that. The modern libertarian agenda does not have its roots or its priorities in its forwardly advertised claims of individual freedoms and ungoverned, undirected behavior. Instead, it's sort of borrowing the mantle of those who have differential advantage within a particular type of social order. Now, for this, there's a very, very long article. I can only recommend you read it. I'm not going to read the entire thing to you. But it's called The True History of Libertarianism in America, a Phony Ideology to Promote a Corporate Agenda. And it breaks down based on a magazine article essentially reprinted, but with different sort of edits done to it. And it basically breaks down that Milton Friedman essentially was heavily a user of the sort of libertarian ideology to be able to co-opt and borrow words like freedom and essentially also things like the market. It's a very decent article, explains some of it, not to be confused with the original individualism. I don't know really who practices that these days. I have heard anarchists sound pretty much in line with that from what I've heard from many of them. But in terms of the big business ones who taught libertarianism, yeah, they're referencing an interesting subset of people who were essentially bought voices on the subject. So that should be a fairly interesting one to look at as well. So there we have it. What do we have? Z-Day coming up in March. We are now calling, at least in London, for people, and we want to call for people around the world in your local areas. If you're in places like New York or Baltimore will be a good one. Baltimore chapter, by the way, very worth checking out because they get some high-profile speakers on and have some really decent events. As far as I remember, co-events with Films for Action. Mr. Horst, I hope I got that right. But yes, have a look for them as well. If there's nothing near you, like I say, try and found something. Try and start something. It doesn't have to be big. We've done them in university lecture halls before. That would see, I suppose, maybe something like 400 or 500, a little bit less, 350, yeah, in the 300s sometimes. We've had them in much bigger venues. I've always found the Friends Meeting House to be rather good. Those are run by the Quakers, and I have found them in many different places. It very much depends on where you live as to how developed their meeting house can be. The ones I've seen in Leeds look a little small, but of course that's to be expected. But the one in London is very big and actually not that expensive. This year we're doing it at the Conway Hall, which is in Red Lion Square. So anybody who wants to travel to the UK one in London, at least, because I'm sure there'll be a Cardiff one, there always is, and various ones in probably further north as well. Birmingham, I know, has decent ones. They will be, nearest tube is Holborn for that one. So look out for that, and there'll be details going up for that, and indeed tickets as well. This year we've actually got written into the program Rao Reynolds from Enter Shikari. He's the singer of that band. They're a sort of a multi-million selling new Sound of Now type band that have very much openly supported our values, the values that exist with employing the scientific method for life in the world. So it's not that we support each other, it's we both support that approach. That's always something quite tricky to sort of remember. And apart from that, I can see my connection is going here. I've had a couple of minutes delay ringing in because of the wonderful inability and innate the market's innate breaking of my goods, the downgrading of every life material. Suboptimal computing, unfortunately, let me down, but then made me think of the vast interconnected reasons as to why that is. And, of course, the whole point of what we're even fighting for. What would it be without a little bit of technical glitch here and there to remind us that we're not immune, even on the very, very basic levels of running programs, let alone, dare I say it, extremely complex systems such as very, very large hospital upgrades that desperately need to be needed in the coming years, and the evolution of all of that stuff that promises to serve us well, but is not a necessity, like we found out from the sort of corruption of human values within the market. It's not a given. It is something that needs to be demanded rather than something that just is hoped for or that one is going to get given. It is always something that's demanded. It's the same as any other basic human right. You name a single one, even down to access to clean water, which is now being called into question by the former, I think it's former Nestle boss, who said that water shouldn't be a human right necessarily, and then goes on to say something like, whether the activists that criticize me for saying such a thing are only talking about the smallest amount, which is only drinking water. But all fresh water is extremely important for the entire ecosystem, man. We can't be restricting that and have corporate rule over it, so it can be turned into useless cola that will kill plants rather than save them. You see what I mean. This is the kind of thing that we talk about. So check our Facebook page as well. That's a good place for us to actually interface at the moment. It basically posts stuff that we do, and it'll certainly send the links to lots of other news items that are relevant. You can just find that by searching the Zeitgeist Movement Global on Facebook. Have something like 138,000 likes, so enough people have found it. But if you like that, add it to your feed. Send us stuff through there. We do use it to monitor what people tell us as well as a general movement. That's the same with every single Facebook page that's run by every single chapter worldwide. Those are administered by by local people. Yeah, definitely get in touch, get involved, offer your services. If you're good at maybe video editing, or you're decent at public speaking, or you have an interesting video to show, that you may have created. We get quite a lot of that. Any sort of things like that. Those things should be shown. If you live a particularly interesting way, have you managed to eradicate money from your life, but you're still operating within a society that essentially demands it in so many different ways? Have you done that? If so, how have you done that? And more importantly, why have you done that? And what do you think could actually be possible without money, but with technology, with the biggest amount of maximally optimized, environmentally conscious, as in the entire environment, including nutrition, including all the atmospherics, including our attitudes to the way the planet moves in the solar system and all the rest of that, down to solar power and things, everything taken into account, and the greatest possibility for enrichment of life taken as the priority and not simple monetary profit. That's worth fighting for. It has to be fought for, unfortunately. It can't just be expected through the voting of human beings by other human beings that have been conditioned by, and I come back to the point that I started with, the propaganda that calls itself public relations, so that you may consider it an industry rather than a way of operation of a society. And then when you realize that every society we've had has essentially had propaganda, has had distorting values broadcast at its audience with the desire that it be retained and acted upon and normalized. When we realize it's the same in every single one, then we've found one of the barometers for the fact that the problem that we have is a systemic human conscious one to do with the fact that we started in hyperlocal places and that we didn't understand anything about anything, but it's time to let it go. And with that, it's time to let go the way that we've organized our lives under that impression, under the impressions of invisible hands and various unprovable concepts about theology and all the rest of it that breathe all the way into the way that we do economics and the way that we structure politics, the way that we think of religion. All of that, just to update that to what we really know rather than what we would like to admit that we know. If we do that, we'll end up in a kind of future that looks very, very different. Wishing everybody a wonderful 2014, and I will see you on the road, and we'll see you on the airwaves, in person, on screen, and hopefully enough times on the news. Who knows? Love you.
The difference between having a job and having a vocation is that a job is some unpleasant work you do in order to make money, with the sole purpose of making money. And there are plenty of jobs because there is still a certain amount of dirty work that nobody wants to do, and that therefore they will pay someone to do it. There is essentially less and less of that kind of work because of mechanization. But if you do a job with the sole purpose of making money, you are absurd. Because if money becomes the goal, and it does when you work that way, you begin increasingly to confuse it with happiness or with pleasure. Yes, one can take a whole handful of crisp dollar bills and practically water your mouth open. But this is as kind of a person who is confused, like a Pavlov dog, who salivates on the wrong bell. It goes back, you see, to the ancient guilt that if you don't work, you have no right to eat. That if there are others in the world who don't have enough to eat, you shouldn't enjoy your dinner, even though you have no possible means of conveying the food to them. And while it is true that we are all one human family, and that every individual involves every other individual, while it is true, therefore, we should do something about changing the situation, the one way of not doing anything about a situation is feeling guilty about it. Because when people feel guilty about a situation, they most usually, instead of doing something practical to change it, they resort to all sorts of symbolic methods of expiation. They go to confession. They see an analyst. They do all kinds of things which will be ways of actually not doing anything about the problem, but feeling all right about it instead. And guilt invariably produces that sort of reaction. It is a destructive emotion. And instead, we need to have a different attitude to our mistakes and to our misdeeds. Walt Whitman always admired animals because they do not lie awake at night and weep for their sins. Animals are practical in the real sense, as are children who haven't been taught this extraordinary hang-up of guilt. Because if you have done something wrong or you have made a mistake, and somebody makes you ashamed of it, you run around licking the sores of your wounded ego because you feel your pride has been hurt. The first thing to understand is that it is not a serious failing in a human being to make mistakes. Everybody has to make mistakes. There is no way out of it. You can't learn anything unless you make mistakes.